Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're at The Listening Post. This week, Bahrain. The Arab uprising that's flying below the radar in much of the news media. Egypt after the fall of Hosni Mubarak. Can state-run media change their tune? Syria has an opposition news channel. Turns out it's been bankrolled by Washington. And here comes the bride in Britain, royal imposters, in our web video of the week. In the wave of uprisings in the Arab world, one of the most prolonged power struggles is taking place on the tiny island of Bahrain. Global news outlets are headlining the war in Libya and the growing violence in Syria. However, the crackdown on the Bahraini opposition movement and on the media trying to cover what's happening there is also a compelling story. The ruling Al Khalifa regime has used a two-pronged approach to contain the news coverage. For the most part, it has locked out the foreign media, and it has locked down local media outlets through a sustained campaign of censorship and intimidation. Another factor at play is Bahrain's position. It's at the intersection of some complex regional politics between Saudi Arabia and Iran, and what happens there could have repercussions throughout the Gulf. Our starting point this week is Bahrain and the convergence of Middle Eastern politics and media repression.
Media was never able to operate freely in Bahrain, not before the social unrest and certainly not since.
A brutal crackdown in Bahrain.
It is news. It is real news, and it is really vital to tell the story of Bahrain.
Flicking between Al Jazeera, Al Arabiya, and Al Alam, it's as if you're watching three different worlds.
The Bahraini uprising did not start out the way Tunisia, Egypt, and Libya did. Most of the Shia protesters were not calling for the overthrow of their Sunni government. They just wanted the same rights as the Sunnis. But that is not how the story has been reported in most of the Bahraini media.
Bahraini government-controlled media trying to portray this as Shia trying to take over a Sunni government, which is not true.
أكاذيب وتقدم دجل وتقدم قصص.
And part of the media strategy of the Bahraini government has been to portray them as zealot Shias who are trying to take over the monarchy with the support of none other than the evil and hated Iran.
It fits into the comfortable narrative that we've grown accustomed to, that there is foreign meddling, that these are not, citizens asking for their inalienable rights, but rather that they are acting on behalf of a larger political player.
There are few media outlets in Bahrain the government does not control. One of them was Al-Wasat, an opposition newspaper. Its coverage of the demonstrations led to its publication being suspended, 3 of its top editors being removed, and the government is taking the paper to court. And that is not the worst of it.
Let's not forget that one of the founders of Al-Wasat and one of its main financiers, Karim Fakhrawi, was detained by Bahraini authorities and was tortured so brutally in custody that he died. And the government's version of events was essentially that the man died of kidney failure. Well, I've seen post-mortem pictures of this man. And if he did in fact die of kidney failure, it's only because they beat him so badly. They caused him that kidney failure.
There was a similarly chilling story involving a blogger who reported on the demonstrations, Zakaria al-Ashiri. Arrested on April 2nd, he died after a week in custody of what the authorities called sickle cell anemia. Again, the pictures belied the official story. Bahrain is a tiny country, a geopolitical microcosm of the Sunni-Shia divide, and that is reflected in the coverage of satellite news channels, like the Saudi-owned Al Arabiya and the Iranian Arabic language Al Alam. Saudi Arabia is ruled by Sunnis, Iran by Shias.
You've got Al Arabiya, which from the outset had been incredibly accusatory towards the protesters, that it was an outright coup. And then you've got Al Alam, which decided to take the side of the protesters outright, and in some cases even foment sectarianism.
Al Alam has basically also tried to manipulate what is happening in Bahrain in order to portray it as some sort of US-driven oppression of people. Of course, that is not true. The media coverage, both by Al Alam and Al Arabiya, has been part of that struggle between Saudi Arabia and Iran that has been stretching for years. And neither side is neutral and neither side is objective.
You're starting to see state policy basically infiltrate broadcasting in such a way that you have a major polarization in how content is covered.
Al Jazeera has not escaped criticism on this story either. Activists say the network has not shown the same level of commitment on Bahrain as it has covering the other Arab uprisings.
There's a new maxim of the media landscape in the Arab world. If it's not on Al Jazeera, it's not news. Now, when it comes to Bahrain, on the Arabic side of Al Jazeera, as you know, the state of Qatar is always submerged and submitted to a barrage of complaints from Arab states, including Bahrain, about the content in it. And therefore, a lot of us activists have been working very hard in order to get coverage on both sides of Al Jazeera.
Al Jazeera is sensitive to those accusations and argues the conditions in Bahrain are different and more difficult.
لتبدأ بعدها مرحلة أخرى من التطورات.
We covered Bahrain much more than most channels and most media outlet in the world. We covered it for hours every day. When it went down, we went down with it, and when before it started really seriously, we were covering it a little bit. However, we have to take into consideration the fact that we don't have an office in Bahrain. Our office was closed down, and our reporter was, their accreditation was taken away, withdrawn. So we couldn't be there on the spot to do, for example, the kind of coverage that we did in Egypt.
The Bahraini government has a double standard on the media, different policies for different audiences. It locks out Arabic language news channels like Al Jazeera, but occasionally opens the country to crews from Western outlets like the BBC and CNN.
The irony, of course, is that they benefit from a conundrum that the Bahraini government has been found itself in, which is that it is trying aggressively to curtail media access to Bahrain, but at the same time, they find themselves forced to let some Western journalists to cover the context because they are Westerners. If they were Arab reporters working for Arab news networks, they would not be let in.
But even that selective policy can backfire on the government. The BBC's Frank Gardner found some semi-official animosity directed at his own network in a pro-government newspaper.
And on the back is a pretty shocking cartoon showing apparently a BBC microphone spitting out venom.
Our second day in Bahrain.
And a CNN team reported its access was strictly controlled, and things grew much worse when CNN tried to visit a human rights activist.
About 20 men in black ski masks pointed machine guns at us. They erased all the video they found. Then we were taken to a police station and interrogated for nearly 6 hours.
Those 4 CNN journalists were clearly mistreated, and that should have never happened. But I think it's very instructive to see how they were treated, and then one can extrapolate how a local Bahraini journalist who doesn't have the high profile and the protection that working for CNN garners for you, how they are treated when they're in custody.
There's no need to extrapolate, not with pictures like this for all the world to see. Our Global Village voices now on the coverage of the ongoing story in Bahrain.
I think that the mainstream media's coverage of the situation in Bahrain is very crucial at this moment, because the government in Bahrain is pretty much counting on the media's interest in other focal points in the region in order to deny its people their rights.
The situation in Bahrain with media being arrested and protesters being killed is a clear attempt to quell the uprising because it does not fit in with the authorized uprisings in Libya that the U.S. backs and supports. It is not in the U.S.'s best interest for what is happening in Bahrain to continue to take place. That is why you're seeing the media blackout.
Journalists have been intimidated. I myself was denied entry to the country twice. At immigration, they asked me, did anybody invite you from the government to report in the country? Domestically, Al-Wasat newspaper, known to be an independent voice in the country, has been targeted repeatedly. I don't think there's any doubt that Bahrain has had a very heavy hand in dealing with protesters and with dissent in the country, but that doesn't mean that dissent has been entirely silenced.
Time now for Listening Post News Bites. 2 of the best journalists in the business have been killed covering the battle for Libya. Tim Hetherington and Chris Hondros were fatally wounded by mortar fire in the northwestern city of Misrata. Hetherington was best known for his work covering the war in Afghanistan. He produced pieces for ABC News' Nightline and directed the documentary film Restrepo, an award winner at the 2010 Sundance Festival. That film was also nominated for an Academy Award. Chris Hondros was a photographer on assignment for Getty Images. He was a fixture in the coverage of conflicts going back to Kosovo in the late 90s and nominated for a Pulitzer Prize in 2004. Hondros was documenting the fighting in Libya almost right up until the end. MSNBC in the U.S. was posting his pictures just 30 minutes before the announcement of his death. Still with Libya, Al Jazeera cameraman Kamel Al-Talu remains in custody there. There is no word on his condition, his whereabouts, or on what grounds the regime continues to hold him. Initially, 4 Al Jazeera staffers were arrested on March 19th. 3 have since been released. Correspondent Lotfi Al-Massoud was freed on April 3rd. A second correspondent, Ahmad Val-Ould Edin, was released the day after that. Cameraman Ammar Al-Hamdan was released 9 days later, April 14th, leaving just Al-Talu in custody. Of the 4, Kamel Al-Talu is the only one with ties to the country he was covering. He is a dual national, Libyan and British. This past January, the U.S. posted an ambassador to Syria for the first time in 6 years. Now that ambassador has some explaining to do. According to previously undisclosed U.S. diplomatic cables published by WikiLeaks, since 2006, the U.S. State Department has been secretly funding Syrian opposition groups, one of which runs the London-based Syrian satellite news channel Barata TV. The 24-hour channel went on the air 2 years ago and has recently stepped up its coverage of the Syrian protests. Washington denies it's trying to undermine the Assad government, although a 2009 diplomatic cable has one U.S. diplomat saying that Syria would surely view the funding of opposition groups as tantamount to supporting regime change. The aftermath of the presidential elections in Nigeria has included a lot of conflicting media claims on who really won. International observers are calling the vote relatively free and fair, but that has not stopped some Nigerian media outlets from disputing the official result, the re-election of President Goodluck Jonathan. The Paris-based media watchdog group Reporters Without Borders has also weighed in on the reporting environment during the campaign. It says it recorded more than 30 attacks on press freedom, despite President Jonathan's promise that reporters would be safe covering the story. Most of the cases involved arbitrary arrests, but some journalists are reporting that they were beaten, threatened, and prevented from covering polling stations where voters faced intimidation by both government and opposition forces. We'll take a closer look at Nigeria next week, when the Listening Post will focus on the state of the media in 3 African countries. 10 months after the fall of Stanley McChrystal, the former U.S. commander in Afghanistan, a Pentagon investigation has cleared the general of wrongdoing and tried to cast doubt on the article that led to McChrystal's removal. The article was published in Rolling Stone magazine and was reported by Michael Hastings. The writer quoted McChrystal and some of his aides as being critical of the Obama administration and its strategy in Afghanistan. The Pentagon investigation consisted of talking to those officials who apparently denied saying what the reporters said they said. Rolling Stone is standing by the article and the reporter, saying it's not surprising that off-the-record sources would deny making damaging comments, especially since their jobs were on the line. It's been over 2 months now since the demonstrations that began in Tahrir Square and then spread across Egypt brought down President Hosni Mubarak. It was a popular uprising in which the media, both new and mainstream, played a central role. These days in Egypt, media outlets that for decades served as mouthpieces for the Mubarak regime or were cowed into critical submission have theoretically had their political restraints removed. They're now in a position to actually criticize the authorities in a way that was not really possible before. But are state-owned newspapers and broadcasters ready for the new role expected of them by the protesters who brought down Mubarak? The Listening Post's Simon Ostrovsky now from Cairo on the direction that Egypt's media are headed in the early days of the post-Mubarak era.
When Cairo erupted, viewers around the globe were watching images like these. But tens of millions of Egyptians who had no internet access or satellite television had only one viewing option: They had to turn on state-run TV, where one of the world's biggest stories was treated as a non-story.
State TV didn't actually show the crowd in Tahrir Square until, I think, perhaps the last day.
Talking about state-owned TV, it was on a different planet in Kukuland.
The whole country and the whole world saw that state media was feeding the public lies.
For decades, Egypt's state-owned media monopoly served as a megaphone for the Mubarak regime's message. Hosni Mubarak is gone, but his media legacy is not forgotten. Not in Tahrir Square, and not by the media-savvy activists who filled the square in February and still go there.
Hosni Mubarak may have stepped down 2 months ago, but on Tahrir Square, it doesn't feel like the revolution is over. Thousands of people have come out here today, in part to protest how the government media is being managed in this new era, and to express their anger about how the interim government is handling political affairs in Egypt today.
Many state-controlled media outlets whose sycophantic news coverage has been discredited along with their reputations have made 180-degree editorial turns that fail to fool viewers.
I just simply don't believe them. I mean, in one night, they changed their opinion from being extremely against revolution into extremely pro-revolution, from extremely pro-Mubarak into extremely against Mubarak.
Though the content of coverage in the state-owned media has changed, the style has stayed the same. And reformist voices say that's because the changes in the state media amount to little more than window dressing. This is the newly appointed editor of Egypt's flagship state-owned newspaper, Al-Ahram, a title that has for years pumped out the Mubarak regime's message. But he was appointed with little regard to an internal election that had been held by the newspaper staff.
I was picked up by the government to be the chief editor of Al-Ahram.
I asked him if he was taking orders from the military rulers of Egypt, who filled the power vacuum left by the former regime.
No, absolutely no. Absolutely no, at all. Nobody talked to me even before they chose me. Nobody of the generals.
Al-Ahram was publicly caught in a lie last year when a blogger discovered that it ran a doctored photograph of Hosni Mubarak on the front page.
This is the original portrait.
The former president was moved from the edge of the photo to its center to reflect, as the newspaper later said, his central role in Middle East diplomacy. Mubarak is no longer center stage, and Al-Ahram's pages, along with state television broadcasts, are today filled with criticism of his regime. But the question now is whether that critical stance will carry over to the new rulers of this country.
You have this enormous, publicly funded, still quite influential state media apparatus that people who don't have access to the internet and don't have access to satellite TV really do depend on, and that it will throw its weight behind certain candidates and not others, and really skew the democratic transition process.
We've lived under repressive regimes for 60 years, and now it's the armed forces that are in control, so they haven't been criticized very much in state media. In fact, state media has been singing the praises of the army, where before it sang the praises of the regime.
Shahira Amin was one of the very few high-profile Egyptian media workers to quit their jobs over the skewed coverage of the protests. And she went on international news channels to explain why.
People are dying here. I don't want to be part of the propaganda machine of this regime. I'm on the side of the people, and that's it.
I would be committing career suicide if I stayed on because of the lack of credibility. And I just simply didn't want to have the blood of the martyrs on my hands. We're at a crossroads, and there need to be major reforms happening.
But reforms won't come easily. These are the Orwellian-scale headquarters of Egypt's government broadcaster. It employs a staggering 43,000 people and houses more than a dozen television and radio stations. Instead of dismantling this vestige of the Mubarak era, the army has fortified it as a strategic asset with an intimidating display of military might. The building has been a focal point for public anger, and protesters enraged by the coverage have on a number of occasions tried to break into the building. But the army has posted units inside the building too, to protect the workers from each other.
It failed miserably, the state media. Okay, the regime collapsed, and had these funds been allocated to healthcare, education, transportation, maybe the uprising would have never happened.
Hisham Qassem wants to refit the shell of this building with a new private TV station, in what he says will be a new golden age for Egyptian media.
I wouldn't dream of getting a broadcast license under Mubarak. Now I have no doubt I'll get it.
Private media is already making its mark post-regime. In early March, Prime Minister Ahmed Shafiq, a Mubarak appointee, was given a rough ride on this program. Within hours of the incident, Shafiq quit his post, setting a milestone for Egyptian media.
That never happened before, and I see this as a very positive sign. It gives Arab media what Arab media should have, like the rest of the developed world, some power, real power.
Private media are not the panacea for what ails the media in this country. Private outlets come with wealthy owners who often have their own political connections and loyalties. But any channel or newspaper that competes with Egypt's mammoth state-owned outlets is a step in the right direction in a revolution that clearly still has a long way to go.
More Global Village Voices now on Egypt and its changing media landscape.
أنا بصراحة مش متفائل خير للمستقبل. نفس المذيعين، نفس الأشكال، هي الأشكال اللي كانت بتكتب علينا وقت ال 18 يوم بتاع الثورة، هي اللي موجودة دلوقتي. ففي جزء كبير مننا جدا مش قادر يعمل حجم من المصداقية بيننا وبينهم.
The optimistic atmosphere that surrounded the post-revolution Egypt, especially in terms of the media, has really become pessimistic. If the Egyptian media wants to seize control of their own destiny, they can't wait for the military and institutions to give them the freedom of press that they so desire.
People were hoping that there would be an opening within Egyptian state media. The army has actually instilled more restrictions upon media, in as much as they are not allowed to report on anything about the army. They are not allowed to talk about any of its decisions without army permission.
Finally, you may have noticed that the Listening Post has almost been a royal wedding-free zone. We're doing our best to avoid doing a story that much of the global media are overdosing on. But our web video of the week is about Britain's Prince William and Kate Middleton. 2 years ago, a couple from the U.S. became a viral sensation when they turned their march down the aisle into a dance video. Well, the mobile phone company T-Mobile has stolen their idea, thrown in some royal doppelgangers, and is rolling up the hits on YouTube. We'll see you next time at the Listening Post.